Check it.
Okay, welcome back. Today we're going to be talking about inverses of functions. Now, what is an inverse of a function? Well, the word inverse kind of sounds like reverse, doesn't it? Reverse meaning to shift into the opposite direction, right? You reverse your car. Well, the inverse of a function is sort of like a different function that does the opposite of your original function. Like, for instance, if you have a function that multiplies everything by 3, there's a function that does the exact opposite. Well, what's the opposite of multiplying by 3? Well, dividing by 3, right? So an inverse function is the opposite of a function, and the two functions undo each other. So you can think of it as like a heater and an air conditioner. Okay, a heater heats up the room and an air conditioner cools down the room. Those two things are opposites and their functions are inverse of each other. So let's start off here by taking some functions and finding their inverses. Now, we're going to do this with two different methods. One method is called the verbal method, which I personally created. And I know you're thinking, why would you teach us something you created? Well, because it's actually very intuitive and helps you understand the process. After we get through the verbal method, which by the way, I will quiz you on, then we'll get into the textbook method, which I call the swap method, because it's less user-friendly, but it is something that you need to know. So let's do the verbal method first. The verbal method is, I call it the verbal method because you have to verbally explain what a function is doing, and that means you have to really understand what's going on with the function, and then you can tell me what the opposite is. So what we're going to do is take a function here, and the function is called f of x, and we're going to verbally describe what's going on with this function. What does this function do to the x's you give it? So if you plug in like a 3, for instance, here, right? Well, you should know that this is going to be f of 3, which is 2 times x plus 1. Well, your x is 3, and you get 6 plus 1, which is 7, right? So that's how a function works. But what did you do to get that 7? Well, first you multiplied by 2, then you added 1. So here's what we're going to do. Here's how you do the problems for the verbal method. You take the name of the function, in this case it's f of x, and you're going to make a column for f of x. And you're going to tell me what this function does. Make a list of steps. So let's start off with x here. There's the x. What happens to the x in this function? Well, the first thing is it gets multiplied by 2. The second thing is it gets added, you add a 1 to it. Now, in case you're not sure which one happens first, think about PEMDAS. Parentheses, exponent, multiply, divide, add, subtract. Multiplying comes before adding in PEMDAS. See, multiplying comes before adding. So we're going to multiply first, then add. So for this function f of x, you locate the x and you say, what's happening to it? Well, the first thing is you're multiplying by 2. Mult by 2. The second thing you're doing is you're adding 1. Add 1. Okay. Now we want to find the inverse of this function, which does two things. It multiplies by 2 and adds 1. What is the inverse? Well, first of all, I have to show you how to write inverse. So this is f of x. Its inverse is called f inverse of x. That's how you pronounce it. The way you write it is f with what looks like a power of -1 and then the of x part. So it's pronounced f inverse of x. This right here is f inverse. Okay? Now, let's say you have a y. The inverse of y would be y inverse like this, y inverse. So the little -1 power is actually not a power. It's just an abbreviation for the word inverse. So it's a notation is what it is, okay? So we're going to find the inverse of f of x, and it's going to be called f inverse of x. We're going to make another column for f inverse. Now, here's the deal. This is going to be the opposite function of this one. So it's going to do the same steps in the opposite order and do the opposite of each step. So if there are 2 steps in this one, there are also going to be 2 steps in its inverse. Okay? There are 2 things happening in the original function. There will be 2 things happening in the inverse. Now, like I said, you're going to be doing the opposite of each step. So what's the opposite of multiplying by 2? Dividing by 2. What's the opposite of adding 1? subtracting 1. But you're also going to do them in the opposite order. So the last one that gets done in the original function will be the first one that gets undone in the inverse function. So what's the opposite of the last thing here? Adding 1. The opposite is subtracting 1. Subtract 1. And what's the opposite of multiplying by 2? Divide by 2. And now you have exactly what you need to write the inverse of f of x. You have a list of steps, and now you can write the function. So, oops, not y, f inverse of x. You need to have the correct name to get the right points. Okay? Don't write f of x because that would be the wrong function. It's f inverse of x equals. And now what you need to do is use this list of instructions here to write me a function that will do these two things here. Okay? So how do you do that? Well, you start by writing the name of the function and an equal sign. Then you start by writing the letter x. That must be your first step. Now, look at the first step here. It says here, subtract 1. So come down to here, whatever's over here, you're going to subtract 1 from it. So this becomes x minus 1. Then, if you look over here, the next thing is to divide by 2. Well, everything you have here gets divided by 2, so you do it this way. Be careful, don't just divide the x by 2. We're not just dividing the x, we're dividing the entire thing here by 2. And there you go, there's your answer. Now I can prove that this is an inverse, sort of. I can prove it for one specific number. If I plug in a 3 here, right, we know we get 2 times 3 plus 1, which is 7. That means if I plug in a 7 here, I should get back to 3 if this is truly the opposite function. It should take me the other way, and I can test that. 7 minus 1 over 2 should equal 3. Well, 7 minus 1 is 6 over 2 equals 3. It does work. So you're shifting this function in reverse, and the answer gives you the question back. Okay? So 3 gives you 7 here, 7 gives you 3 here. They are opposites. Okay? So that's the verbal method. Now, just to be clear, you have to do all 3 steps. The first step is to write a list of what the first function is doing. That's 1 point. The second step is to write a list of what the inverse is doing, which is really easy because you do the opposite of what you see here, right? And then the third step is writing the function, and that's your 3rd point. Okay, let's do a couple more examples until this sinks in. How about this function right here? So this function is called y. So we're going to do 2 columns, 1 column for y and 1 column for y inverse. Now what's happening with y? Well, if you give it a number x, right, like 3 or something like that, the first thing that happens to the number is that number gets squared. So number 1 is square whatever you give it. And then after that, you add 5. So your inverse function, that's the only 2 things that are happening in this function here. Your inverse function will do the opposite of these 2 steps in the opposite order. So it's also going to have 2 steps, but the last step here becomes the first step here. Now, what's the opposite of adding 5? You're subtracting 5. And what's the opposite of squaring your x? Square rooting. Square root. Okay, so we're 2/3 done. We have our list here. This will be on the quiz where you have to give me these lists. And now the last thing is to write me your function. Now the function, the inverse function, has to have the right name. So if you write y equals, that's going to be instantly wrong because that's referring to this function. We want the inverse, so make sure you write y inverse. Now there's no of x like last time. It's not f inverse of x or y inverse of x, it's just y. So y inverse. And now we need to write a function that does these 2 things. Once again, here we go again. Make sure you start by writing the letter x. That's your first step. If you don't do that, the rest of this doesn't work. So start off by writing the letter x. Now, whatever it says here, do this thing. Subtract 5. Well, we're going to just put a -5 there. That's nice and easy, right? Then, whatever's here, all the stuff that's here, we're going to apply the next step, which is square root. So put a square root over this, and there you go. There's your inverse. Okay, let's do one more. Okay, now this one's got 3 things happening, and it's called g of x. We'll make a column for the function. G inverse of x is the name of the inverse. We'll make a column for that. And then the last thing we're going to do is write a function g inverse of x equals, and we'll put the rest in here. Okay, so what's happening in g of x? You plug in a number here, right? You plug in something there into your x. So locate your x. The first thing you do is locate your x. Where's your x? It's right there. What's happening to it? Well, as soon as you plug a number into it, the first thing you do is multiply. So the first step is multiply by 2. Mult by 2. You need to write this out. The second thing that happens is that you're going to add 3. So add 3 is your second operation there. The last thing you do is divide everything by 5. So divide by 5. That's a verbal description of what's written here. This is why it's called the verbal method, because you're translating a function written as mathematics into a series of verbal statements. Now, we're going to use this series of verbal statements to figure out what the inverse does. Now, if this has 3 steps, this will also have 3 steps. So 1, 2, 3. We need to take the opposite of all of these steps here and put them in the opposite order. So be careful, you're not going to take the first thing here and do the opposite here. You're going to take the last thing here. The last step here is going to be the first step here. Is going to be the opposite of the first step here. So what's the opposite of dividing by 5? The opposite of dividing by 5 is multiply by 5. Then what's the opposite of adding 3? Subtract 3. That's going to be the middle one. And then finally, this will be over here. What's the opposite of multiplying by 2? Divide by 2. So here we go. That's your inverse right there written verbally. But now we need to write it algebraically. Okay? So we're 2/3 of the way done. I need a function that takes your x, multiplies it by 5, takes everything that you get from that, subtracts 3, takes everything you got from all this, and divides it by 2. So what I'm going to do is start by writing the letter x. That's always the first step for writing your inverse. Start by writing the letter x. Now, what does it say here for the first step? Multiply by 5. How do you do that? Simple. You put a 5 in front of it. Now it's 5x. Now take everything that's here and apply the next step. Subtract 3. Well, there you go. -3. All done. Now take everything that's here and do the last thing, divide by 2, which means all of this here gets divided by 2, and there you go. That is your inverse. That's G inverse, and that's called the verbal method. Okay? Copyright Abdul Hadi 2004. Now, the verbal method works really well on simple functions, but it doesn't work for tables and ordered pairs, which is why we still need to learn the textbook method. Okay? And in the homework, I'm going to ask you to do some things verbally and some things algebraically. Now, the algebraic method, I have dubbed the swap method, only because the main step is you're going to swap x and y. That's the big deal here. So just to give it a name, I'm going to call it the swap method. And so you have the verbal method and you have the swap method. Certain homework questions require you to use the verbal method. Certain questions are going to require you to use this swap method. How does the swap method work? Okay, well, we just did this problem a minute ago. We just did this problem using the verbal method, and we know the answer. There's the answer right there. Okay? So we already know what the answer is, but it's not about the answer, it's about the process. So let's do this using the swap method, and you'll see whether or not, there's a big difference in the methods. Now, the swap method has 4 steps to it. Step 1, you must write your function as a y equals function. Step 2, you have to swap, and this is why it's called the swap method, x and y. Wherever you see a y, you write it as x. Wherever you see an x, you write it as y. Step 3, you're going to solve for y. Okay, solving for y means getting the y by itself. And then 4, rename, okay? You have to rename, it's hard to talk and write at the same time sometimes. You have to rename the equation back to the correct name of the inverse. Rename as inverse. And I'll talk about that when I get there. Okay, so here we go. These are the 4 steps right here, and we're going to be using those for all the problems going forward. Now, the first step is write this as a y equals function. Now, what does that mean? It means we need to have this be y equals, not g of x. So temporarily, we're going to rename this to y equals. So we'll write y equals, and we'll just copy the rest. Okay, that's step one. Step two, swap the x and y. Wherever you see a y, write an x. Wherever you see an x, write a y. Step three, solve for y. This means get the y by itself. So here's what you're going to have to do. You need to get rid of this 2, get rid of this 3, and get rid of this 5. Well, how do you do that? Well, you can't do anything as long as this is a fraction. So your first move is going to have to be to make the fraction part go away. How do you make something that is a fraction become not a fraction? You get rid of its denominator. So how can I get rid of this denominator? Well, this denominator is here because you're dividing something by 5. So do the opposite, multiply by 5. That will cancel that out, and now you've successfully done that. But here's the thing, if you're going to multiply this side by 5, you have to multiply this side also by 5 to keep it balanced. Now we have 5x over here, and we have 2y plus 3 over here. Okay, we're still working on getting y by itself. So what else do we do? Now we can subtract 3 from both sides. Now, this becomes 5x minus 3, and this is now 2y. I'm just going to continue over here. So 5x minus 3 equals 2y. Now the last thing is to get rid of this 2. Now this is 2 times y, so we'll divide by 2. And finally, we got the y by itself. Now what I'm going to do is flip this around so that the y is on the left side, because when you solve for something, that thing should be on the left, not on the right. So we're going to have y equals 5x minus 3 over 2. Now here's the thing. You need to rename this with the proper name. Y is completely wrong. First of all, we made it up. We only temporarily called this y. So to name this correctly and get your full credit, you look at the original function. The original function was called g of x. So its inverse will be called g inverse of x. And then you have this part here, 5x minus 3 over 2. And that's your answer. Now look at all the work we did here, and then compare it to the verbal method, okay, where we wrote ourselves 3 steps, and then boom, went straight to the answer. All right, so the verbal method is not harder. In fact, I think it's a lot easier, and it makes a lot more sense than just saying follow these steps blindly. So anyway, we have to be able to do both. That is the same exact problem done with the verbal method. Sorry, with the swap method. So you have to start with y equals, because if you're going to swap x and y, it doesn't make sense to swap x and g of x. It just doesn't work. So you need to write it as a y temporarily until you do the swap. And then when you're done, put back the g of x, but call it g inverse of x, not g of x. All right, let's try another one. Okay, so this one's called h of x. First step is write as y equals. So it's originally called h of x, but we're going to call it y temporarily. The second step is to swap x's out for y's. So every time you see a y, even if there's multiple, well, you're only going to see one y, but if there's multiple x's, they all become y's. So y becomes x here, and x becomes y here. Now we need to solve for y, meaning get the y by itself. Well, we can't do anything as long as this square root is here. So how do you get rid of a square root? Well, what's the opposite of square root? Squaring. So we'll square both sides. If we square both sides, that gets rid of, the square root kills the square, and now this just becomes 2y plus 5 here, and this side becomes x squared. Okay, continue getting the y by itself. We can subtract 5 from both sides. This now becomes x squared minus 5 over here, 2y over here. All right, let's just continue this over here. Still need to get the y by itself. There's a 2 here, so I'm going to divide this by 2 and divide this side by 2. By the way, you have to divide the whole side by 2, not just one of these things. Okay, and now that the y is by itself, I'm going to move it to the left side, because that's where it has to be, and copy the rest. And now we come down to the last step, rename as the correct inverse. Well, I know I'm temporarily using y here, but the inverse of h of x is called h inverse of x, and that's going to be the name of my answer. And you must have the name here. There you go. That's the swap method for this problem. Okay. Now you could do it with the verbal method, but in the homework you're going to be instructed to do certain problems one way, certain problems the other way. Now, where the swap method really comes in handy and where the verbal method does not work is for the problem like this one here. These two problems right here. You can write functions in many different ways. You can express a function as a graph. You can express a function as an algebraic equation. You can express a function as a table. And you can express a function as a series of ordered pairs. xy, 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 x comma y. So for algebraic functions, the verbal method works great. But for ordered pairs and tables, the swap method is a lot faster. I'll do a table first, actually. So you have a function here called f of x, and here's a table of f of x. So I want to find the inverse of that. Well, the inverse of a table is going to be another table. So I need to draw myself a table. And it'll still be x over here, but this side, instead of being f of x, will be f inverse of x, because that's what you call the inverse of f of x. So what's going to be the inverse part? Well, it's called the swap method for a reason. You're just going to swap the x's and these are the y's for all intents and purposes. So you're going to just swap the columns here. So instead of 3 and then 5, it's going to be 5 and 3. Negative 2 and 6, 6 and negative 2. 7 and 10, 10 and 7. 12 and negative 12, 6 and negative 12, negative 12 and 6. Literally just swapping the x's and y's and you're done. So any kindergarten student can do that. And it's something that doesn't require any thought. So given a table, the most important, the only thing I can really grade you on, okay, because that's just too easy, is whether or not you do everything, you get all the formatting correct. So be careful. Make sure that your table is formatted correctly. Same thing goes for the ordered pairs. What's the name of the inverse? Well, this is f of x. The name is going to be f inverse of x. And look how this thing is formatted. You have these squiggly braces here, right? And then you have these parentheses for the ordered pairs. And then you have the ordered pairs themselves inside the parentheses, right? And once again, this is an x, this is a y, this is an x, this is a y, this is an x, this is a y, this is an x, this is a y. And it's called the swap method. So you're going to swap the x's and y's. So instead of 2 comma 5, it's 5 comma 2, 1 comma 7, negative 3 comma 10, and well, 4 and 4, even if you swap them, it's still 4 and 4, 4 comma 4. And you see there's nothing really to it except for swapping the numbers. So most of your grade comes from, do you format this thing correctly? Okay, if you just write this if you don't include your f inverse of x, or if you forget the equal sign, or if you don't draw the brackets. Now, here's the thing. Some people have a hard time making these squiggly brackets look good. I mean, if you're really having a hard time with it, you can be more boxy with it, like something like that, if you must. Okay, or if you're really having a hard time with it, you can maybe do something like that. I don't know. Add a little bump to it. But just try your best. Okay, try your best. Just don't do parentheses. Some people will just do that and think it's good enough. It's not good enough. Okay, because these parentheses are different than the braces. But yeah, that's it. Okay, if you can copy the formatting correctly, and that's what I'm going to ask you to do in the quiz, I'm just going to give you a function like this written in ordered pair form, and your inverse has to just be perfect from a formatting standpoint, because honestly there's nothing else going on here except for swapping numbers, and that's straight up kindergarten. Okay, so we are done. You notice that some of the problems require verbal method and some of them the swap method. Now in the assignment, it'll say find the inverse and then graph it. Don't graph anything because we're doing graphing in the next lesson. So for you guys, don't graph anything. Just find the inverse using the method indicated, and that's it. Okay, we're done. Have a great day. See you at the next video.
Check this.